So today I'm going to just talk to you guys about why I think viruses are cool, and hopefully convince most of you that viruses are cool too. Because most people don't know what a virus is, they're really, really small. I'm going to start off the talk with what a virus is. From there, I'm going to go over some really cool examples of viruses that exist in the real world, and then after that, I'm going to take a brief overview of stepping back and looking at the planet Earth from a bigger picture, and then looking at how viruses actually impact the planet as a whole. So, first of all, let's look at what a virus is. To begin, I'd like to look at something that people are more familiar with, the human body. So if we think about a human body, the human body just looks like a human from the outside. But if you peel off the skin, you see a whole bunch of organs on the inside. And these organs are what allow the human body to function and live as like one giant organism. And I just wanted to bring this to mind because this is a metaphor I'd like to extend to help explain something a bit more small. That is the cell. And so, much similar to the human body, the cell, if you look at it from the outside, is just some mass, some organism. However, if you peel back the cell membrane, the outer casing of the cell, just like if you peel back the skin of a human, you will see smaller things inside the cell called organelles. And these are much like the organs inside the human body, but they're much smaller, and they each have specialized functions inside the cell to help it live and function. So, if you look in the middle of the cell here, you'll see that smaller sphere, and that is called the nucleus. Many people use this as the analogy for the brain of the cell because this is where all the commands that the cell makes are stored. If you look at this thing here, the mitochondrion, that little blobby thing above the nucleus, that is often described as the powerhouse of the cell. So there's different organelles in the cell, and they each have their own special functions in helping the cell function. So the cell is actually generally thought of as being made of 4 different building blocks. The first are lipids, and these are more commonly known as fats, so things like oil, butter, things like this, same building blocks. And lipids are what actually make up the cell membrane, so the outer casing of the cell, the skin. They also make up the smaller compartments inside the cell, like the nucleus. Then there are proteins, and whereas lipids are more structural, they form like the walls around the cell. Proteins are the molecules inside the cell that do things. So if you have something in your cell that you want to move, if your cell wants to move some type of food molecule or something from one end of the cell to the other, they will use proteins. If they want to allow things into the cell or let things out of the cell, like a door, something that's functional, they will use proteins. Next building block is DNA. And I'm sure many of you have heard of DNA. DNA is what stores the instructions for the cell. This is where all the instructions on how to make the cellular components, the proteins, etc., are all stored. And the DNA is actually stored in the nucleus, so the brain of the cell, which is why it's called the command center. And the DNA never leaves the nucleus, with the exception of when the cell's replicating, but we won't go into too much detail with that. So when the cell actually wants to bring these instructions out of the nucleus into the actual cell, where the instructions can be read and communicated to the rest of the cell, it is transcribed into RNA. So the DNA is like a book in the library that you can't take out. And if the cell wants to communicate something outside of the nucleus, there's a little protein that goes into the nucleus, copies down a copy of the DNA into something called an RNA molecule, and then the RNA molecule moves out of the nucleus into the cell, where it then tells the cell to build other things. So I just bring this up before I start talking about the virus. So very much similar in extending this metaphor. A virus just looks like a blob from the outside. But again, if you peel back the skin, you see all these different components. So, if you look at the very outside of this virus, it also has a lipid membrane. Not all viruses have lipid membranes like cells do, but some of them do. Those things sticking out of the lipid membranes are proteins. And these proteins are what allow the virus to identify its host cell and latch onto it and attack the cell. If you look inside the virus, those little the little red spheres, that is called the capsid. And this is a protein protective layer, much like the nucleus of the cell, which houses the DNA or RNA of the virus. So if you look inside the capsid, that purple region, that is the nucleic acid of the virus. So this is what all the information the virus is capable of doing is stored, and it is stored inside that protein capsid, which is sometimes stored in that lipid membrane. So, what is a virus? In general, a virus is considered any small infectious agent that contains at least a capsid, so that protein coat surrounding either some form of nucleic acid, whether it be DNA or RNA. Some viruses, like I said, do have a lipid envelope, but that's not required for viruses. But even scientists right now have problems defining what a virus is. There are things called prions, which are simple proteins without any nucleic acid at all, and those are actually considered viruses right now by much of the scientific community. These prions are capable of entering a cell and creating copies of themselves without any instructions at all besides their own misfolding. So there are also things called viroids, and viroids are actually really, really simple viruses. They're actually only about 10 base pairs long. They're only known to infect plants currently, but whereas a virus is typically about 1 million base pairs long. So that's quite big. Viroids are only about 10 base pairs long, and they actually infect plants, and they can replicate on their own. So they aren't, most virologists don't consider them actual viruses like true viruses, but they are classified as viruses by a lot of the scientific community. So it's important to note that although viruses are very interesting, they're also very novel. They're brand new, and most of the scientific community actually is unsure about what they would like to call a virus. So from here, I'd like to look at virus diversity. So one important thing to note is that every living organism on the planet has that nucleus stored stuff inside called DNA that I mentioned before. And all organisms known use DNA as a template for its instructions. There's one exception to this, and this is viruses. Viruses can actually use DNA as a template, but they can also use RNA. And in addition to this, whereas bacteria, humans, plants, etc. all use double-stranded DNA as a template, viruses have the capacity to use double-stranded DNA, but also double-stranded RNA, single-stranded DNA, and single-stranded RNA. And additionally, viruses can actually go back and forth between these different templates, whereas cells often lack this ability. So, because of this diversity, you see a whole bunch of different viruses in the world, and with a lot of different capacities, which I'll start going into soon. This mere diversity of the genetic content, without looking at some of the functional aspects of viruses, I think personally makes them way cool. So, looking at shapes of different viruses. If you can see here, this is called an Ebolavirus, and it's often called the Mickey Mouse virus because, as you can see, the Mickey Mouse head at the tail. So some viruses are really long like this and filamentous. However, some viruses actually look like this, which is what many people think of a virus. It has that satellite shape on it. This is called a T4 phage, and it infects bacteria. Some viruses are much more simple, and this is a Crow-V/Mimi virus, I can't remember which, but this is just called an icosahedral virus, and it's simple as circle. And these filamentous things are actually proteins, carbs, and lipids sticking out of the virus. So the viruses also come in a wide variety of shapes, which can also influence very different things about the virus. Very different shapes, way cool. So, as I mentioned before, viruses come in very different shapes. However, they also come in very different sizes. This is a brand new virus discovered a couple of years ago called megavirus. Megavirus is 440 nanometers in diameter. That probably doesn't mean very much to many of you right now, but we'll get into that later. It's quite large. Inside of its capsid, there's actually a 1.3 megabases of DNA. That is about the same size as some of the smallest bacteria, so this virus is actually sort of crossing the line between the non-living and the living, because viruses are generally not considered alive. It actually holds many of the instructions to build its own proteins that allow it to replicate on its own. So it's really starting to bridge the boundaries between what cellular life is and what viruses are. However, whereas this virus is massive, there are also much smaller viruses. As you can see that little purple thing, this is to scale. That is called a Parvovirus. You can see it in the little corner there. Parvoviruses are only 18 nanometers in diameter. So if you look at a range from 18 nanometers in diameter to 440 nanometers, that's quite a big difference. If you remember back to the Mickey Mouse virus, if you look at length instead of like the circle, the Mickey Mouse virus can actually extend to be about 1,200 nanometers long. So there's massive size differences in these different viruses. Another reason why I personally think they're way cool. So, as I mentioned before, megavirus has one of the largest has the largest virus genome that we currently know about. If we compare it to the smallest bacteria, they have approximately the same genome size. This is the smallest free-living bacteria. So this is a bacteria that you can culture in a flask without any other organisms that can live on its own. If you compare it to the smallest known living organism, which is Candidatus carcinella rudi, It is an obligate parasite of an archaea, which is similar to bacteria. The genome of this virus is actually 10 times larger than this parasite. And the parasite itself is actually these little blue lines attacking the thing in the middle. The thing in the middle is actually a nucleus of one of those cells I mentioned before. So it's quite small. So why I differentiate between free living and non-free living is because these organisms actually cannot live on their own. They're an organism that requires the host that lives in to survive. So because of that, it's been able to throw away a lot of its DNA and reduce its genome quite a bit. But because of that, it now has a genome that's 10 times smaller than a virus, which is quite small. And because of this, again, I would say viruses are quite cool. So how do viruses work? So I talked about cells before. And cells have the capacity to live on their own because they have all these things inside of them called organelles, which have different functions that allow them to live on their own, produce their own proteins, manufacture their own food, etc. Viruses do not have organelles. They lack this ability to actually live on their own. If you take a virus and you put it in a bucket of water, the virus will be able to reproduce on its own. It will just sit there. Whereas if you put a cell in a bucket of water, if it has the required nutrients, it will be able to replicate on its own. However, where viruses are special is viruses are master thieves. So, what do viruses do? Those proteins on the outside of the virus that I mentioned before that are used to identify cells, it's sort of like those are the locks that the virus holds. And these locks, as the virus moves through your body, or some other body, or other type of cell, it takes those locks and uses those locks to identify other proteins on other cells, which are like keys. And once it identifies a lock that fits into the right keyhole, the virus is actually able to unlock itself into the cell. And it's able to inject its either whole capsid or just its genetic content into the cell. And from there, it's able to take control over the cell's organelles and basically take over that cell as its own body. And from there, it's able to use the cell's machinery and nutrients and everything else the cell has to produce more viruses of its own. Some viruses are actually able to produce millions and millions of virus particles from one cell before it actually kills the cell off. Cells have a very limited capacity in stopping viruses, so viruses are actually master thieves and they're really good at taking advantage of their hosts. Despite the fact that they have nothing of their own to enable them to do this, the fact that they can steal things and have evolved to do this makes them quite amazing. Or cool, as we would put them in the lecture. So now I've gone over some of the basics of viruses. I'm going to start walking you guys through some really cool viruses that we see in the real world. So first, how many of you have heard of human papillomavirus? So human papillomavirus, or HPV, is this virus here. It's simple icosahedral virus. It has a double-stranded DNA genome, so that's the same type of nucleic acid as we have. And it has no envelope, so it's lacking that skin that I mentioned before around it. There are currently 120 different types of HPV known, with many different, some of them do different things to you than others do. Some of them actually show very little symptoms. And there's vaccines against 4 of these different types of viruses currently. The most common symptom that is associated with human papillomavirus is warts. So, in addition to warts, however, these viruses have the capacity to turn some of your tissue cancerous. So some of these different types of HPV can actually, in the process of replicating inside your cell, alter your DNA to a point where that cell loses its capacity to control its own replication, and it starts building more and more cells out of its own control. The virus doesn't really intend to do this because it doesn't always work in favor of the virus, but as a byproduct of the virus replication, you start getting these warts, which are pretty much tumors from your cells replicating too fast and building up in dense clusters like this. The ability for the virus to actually do this type of thing, though, I would say is pretty cool. How many of you heard, I don't know if any of you have, but have any of you heard of Parvovirus B19? Oh good, we have a couple of people. So, this is Parvovirus B19. It's another smaller virus. It's also icosahedral, so round. Similar to the previous virus, it also is naked. It has no skin. However, this one has a single-strand DNA genetic content. It's transmitted through the air, but it can also be transmitted through blood. And what this virus does is it creates a disease called Fifth disease. And Fifth disease is also known as slap child syndrome. It's called this because of the red rash it produces usually on children's cheeks, and it makes it look as if the child had been slapped. However, this virus is actually, depending on how severe the infection gets, can also cause other complications such as arthritis, anemia, and birth defects. So this virus, despite being the smallest known virus that infects vertebrates, is, in my opinion, way cool. So, how many of you have heard of herpes viruses? So, this is a herpes virus. In fact, how many of you have heard of chickenpox before? How many of you knew chickenpox was the type of herpes virus? So, this is another microscope picture of chickenpox virus. Again, although it doesn't look like it's also a similar dicosahedral shape. It has an envelope, so this one has the skin, and it also has a double-stranded DNA genome. The scientific name for chickenpox is varicella zoster virus, and the main form of transmission for this is through aerosols, through the air. And chickenpox, as many of you know, is these little pustules / rashes that appear on your body. And they're really, really itchy. And they generally attack your torso and your head, although sometimes they go on your limbs as well. So the interesting thing to learn about herpes viruses, and why many of you know you can only get chickenpox once typically, is because once you get infected with the herpes virus, they go into something called latency. And this means that once they infect your cell, they will remain in that cell forever and ever. The reason why the symptoms disappear is because eventually, once the viruses clue in that they need to enter a latent phase to actually survive in that cell, is they stop reproducing enough to produce the symptoms. They just produce enough to actually maintain their infection in your body. So these viruses will actually remain in your nervous system cells for the rest of your life. Sometimes they will become reactivated when you're stressed, in which case you get a disease called shingles. But this is the interesting thing about herpes viruses, is they can remain in your body forever and ever without you actually knowing it. In fact, 98% of people carry a herpes virus called HMP, I think, HMV. And this virus has no symptoms for most people unless you are immunodeficient. So if your immune system isn't working properly, at which point you actually get quite severe symptoms. Anyhow, the fact that herpes virus can remain in your system forever and ever, latent, I think is quite cool. How many of you have heard of a more severe type of pox virus called smallpox? So, smallpox looks like this. This is a more complex type of virion, and it's also transmitted through aerosols. However, it can also be transmitted through fomites. And fomites are anything you touch when you're infected. So if you cough in your hands and you touch a doorknob, and somebody else touches that doorknob, the viruses can actually survive on that doorknob and long enough for them to attach to the other person's hand and infect that other person. So fomites are objects that harbor viruses long enough for other people to get them. The other way it's transmitted is through bodily fluids. So like sneezing, if you sneeze and you put spit into the air, that transmits them. There are 4 types of smallpox known. I'm going to go through 2 of them, but before I switch the slide, I also wanted to point out smallpox is commonly characterized by its capsid shape, which many of you will recognize as a pad-like shape. So I'm going to go through a couple of the well-known virus capsids. So the first type of smallpox I like to go over is called ordinary smallpox. And this type of smallpox, as you can see with this little girl here, it's characterized not like chickenpox, where most of the pustules are all over your torso and your face. Instead, most of the pustules come all over your face and your extremities, so your limbs, your arms and your legs. And what these little things do is they're just buildups of pus-like substance under your skin. And if you pop them, it actually came out with something very similar to pus, which is why I call them pus-like pustules. And they also had little indents in the center of each of them, so these look sort of like donuts. The big issue with smallpox was that if you ever scratch these pustules, or even if you just let them heal, they would often leave severe scarring. If people got them around their eyes, they could often leave people blind. And they could also lead to limb deformities. So if you got severe smallpox, like ordinary smallpox, you could actually get quite deformed arms and legs. However, smallpox also had a large possibility for death. About 20% of cases of smallpox, before there was any way of treating it, had the problem of death. So the second type of smallpox I'd like to talk to you about is a much rarer form, and it's called hemorrhagic smallpox. So hemorrhagic smallpox only occurred in about 2% of cases of people who got smallpox, but this was also often called blackpox. I don't know if any of you have heard of blackpox. No? Okay. Blackpox is a much more rare disease, and unlike smallpox, blackpox actually, you don't see the same pustules. It's called blackpox because although your skin remains smooth, you actually start to bleed out under your skin. So it begins to look like your body becomes one giant bruise. And because of this, once your skin turns all blue/dark purple, it became known as blackpox. And unfortunately, blackpox, in really severe cases, could actually detach your entire skin from your body and cause you to bleed out that way. And because of this complication, there were actually very few survivors who got hemorrhagic smallpox. So that's the most gruesome way you can think of with hemorrhagic smallpox of actually visualizing it. However, other complications is it caused hemorrhaging of most of your internal organs. So your spleen, your kidneys, etc. would all just turn into mush inside your body, and you would collapse that way as well. So this, although it's one of the bigger viruses, it has a genome size of about 0.2 megabases, so 200,000 base pairs. It's actually able to do all these different symptoms. And for that reason, I call them way cool, as gruesome as they are. Have any of you heard of Rotavirus? So Rotavirus looks like this. It's another icosahedral virus. As you can tell, it's quite common shape. Rotavirus it's naked again. It doesn't have that lipid skin I mentioned before. It has a double-stranded RNA genome. So this is bizarre because double-stranded RNA is actually quite stable. It's actually really hard to get apart those two pieces of RNA for the virus to replicate. So it's really bizarre that an animal is actually, or an organism rather, has been able to adapt to maintain this. But this virus transmits through the fecal-oral route. So this is why they often tell you to wash your hands after going to the washroom, because if you don't wash your hands, you can be transmitting the virus this way. However, this virus can also be transmitted through fomites again and through aerosols. And a unique thing about this virus, it's especially stable in the environment. So if you have a water source in the environment, this virus can actually survive in that water source for a really, really long time. The main symptom caused by this virus is severe diarrhea. And this virus is actually one of the leading causes of death in children under the age of 5 worldwide, and it kills, I think, 500,000 children per year. So it's quite a bit. Clearly, this is more common in third world countries where they lack the sanitation that we have, but it's still a really big killer of children around the world. It's way cool that it's able to do all of this despite its small size. How many of you have heard of poliovirus? So this is poliovirus, another really small virus, icosahedral. It's lacking the skin I mentioned before, and this time it has a single-stranded RNA genome. So the interesting thing about poliovirus is it has a positive sense single-stranded RNA genome. And what this means is that if you actually remove the skin of the shell of the virus and just took that genome and put it into another person's cell, no matter what cell you put it into, that virus would start replicating again. So this is the unique thing about positive sense single-stranded RNA viruses. If you take their genome and put it into any cell in the world, it will be able to start making viruses all over again on its own. Transmission of this virus is through the fecal-oral route, most commonly, but also through the oral route. So if you do if sharing food, sometimes it could spread poliovirus, although it's much less known. Poliovirus caused several different symptoms. Typically, poliovirus infections are actually asymptomatic, so you don't express any symptoms at all. 90% of cases of poliovirus have no symptoms, like not even flu-like symptoms. You don't know you have it, which is why poliovirus is really hard to get rid of. Whereas smallpox I showed you before, it's one of 2 diseases in the world that have been eradicated so far. Poliovirus is on the list of to be eradicated. They're working on eradicating, so getting rid of, so that nobody can be infected by it ever again. Poliovirus and measles. The hard thing with poliovirus is whereas measles is you obviously see the rash that you get from measles, poliovirus often emits no symptoms. So you don't know who has the virus and who is potentially spreading it. So poliovirus is actually a really big struggle for the World Health Organization right now because they're trying to figure out where they can actually narrow down on targeting this virus. So most people who do get symptoms only develop flu-like symptoms, so your typical fever, runny nose, cough type things. However, in about 1% of cases, polio is paralytic. So this means you can go to sleep one night feeling perfectly fine and wake up next morning and you can't move your arm or you can't move your leg. And you won't know any reason why this is, you'll just know that you've lost the ability to move that. And quite often you never regain this ability. This is because poliovirus, although it infects a lot of your gut cells, if it moves into your bloodstream and infects your nervous system, it can actually kill your nerves so that your body loses the ability to move your muscle. However, have any of you heard of iron lungs before? So this is what happens when poliovirus paralyzes not your arms and legs, but instead paralyzes your organs. So there's a big problem back when poliovirus is much more common, when poliovirus paralyzed people's lungs. So people would wake up in the middle of the night without the ability to breathe. And this is a facility where poliovirus when poliovirus is much more common, and babies were waking up in the middle of the night without the ability to breathe. So this iron lung is, they had to put the baby into this iron lung, and the iron lung would change the air pressure of the chamber to actually get the baby's lungs to move on its own. Because the baby can no longer breathe on its own, it needed this machine to live. And typically, it could only sustain the babies for so long. Anyhow, this paralytic virus is quite unique in its paralysis abilities, and for that reason, as gruesome as it is, it's quite cool. How many of you have heard of human immunodeficiency virus? Yeah, this is one of the more common ones. So, HIV, as it's more commonly known, it has an envelope, so it has that lipid skin. It has a positive sense RNA genome, just like poliovirus. This one's slightly different in that it needs its own proteins to actually be able to replicate. So if you put this one into another cell like poliovirus, it won't be able to replicate on its own. The unique thing about this type of virus, it's called a retrovirus. So it takes its genome, it transcribes it on its using its own proteins into DNA. Then it takes its DNA and it puts it into your cells. So once it enters your own genome, it becomes part of who you are, and it can never be taken out. So once your cells start replicating, your immune cells that this infects, all of those little baby immune cells that you're producing all now have the HIV virus in it. So it's really hard to get rid of. As I mentioned before, I'm going to talk about some of the unique capsid shapes. HIV is characterized by, as you can see, the purple shape of the capsid. It's often characterized as a coffin, as is often stereotyped by HIV. And it's transmitted through body fluids, most typically blood. So HIV leads to a disease called AIDS, or acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. And what this disease basically does is it collapses your adaptive immune system. And this means that if you get infected by anything, your body no longer has the ability to fight it off. So, as some of you know, there's a lot of bacteria currently living on and in your body. Likewise, you also have a lot of viruses that are in your cells that you simply are living with you, not harming you. However, once you get this disease, a lot of those bugs that are on you or in you are no longer suppressible by your body, and they can slowly start taking over. So although there is very viable treatment for AIDS right now, at least in suppressing the symptoms of some of these diseases, without treatment, things that are naturally on you and that you can normally fight off, like a common cold, can start to kill you quite easily. And this ability for the virus to completely take over some of your most amazing defense abilities, I think is quite cool. How many of you heard of Rabies virus? So, Rabies virus has that skin I mentioned before, that lipid skin, and it has a negative sense RNA. So if you take this RNA genome and put it into a cell, it doesn't do anything at all. It gets degraded. Another recognizable capsid, so that protein shell, Rabies virus often looks like a bullet. So, and likewise, this one is also transmitted through body fluids, although this one is most typically transmitted through saliva or bites. So, this is one of the more bizarre virus symptoms that you can see. Used to be called one of the really scary viruses because it was 100% fatal. So if you get, as many of you know, if you ever get bit by a dog, you're supposed to get checked out for rabies. And you're supposed to get checked out because sometimes you don't know if you get it. Rabies onset of the symptoms can take anywhere from 4 days to over 6 years. So you can actually get bit by a dog and not know you have rabies for 6 years. Although the initial symptoms are flu-like, I should mention that these flu-like symptoms you commonly see in viruses are caused by your immune system, not actually by the virus itself. Rabies virus attacks your nervous system, so it attacks your brain. And quite quickly, the flu-like symptoms elevate to paralysis in parts of your limbs, anxiety, so nervousness, insomnia, the lack of the ability to sleep, confusion, agitation, so you become angry, paranoia, you become constantly scared, terror, hallucinations, delirium, hydrophobia, which means you become scared of water. Most people who get rabies eventually die within 10 days because they lack the ability to drink anything because they become so incapable of swallowing. And also your personality collapses. So, although I mentioned before it used to be 100% fatal, there is now a protocol called the Milwaukee Protocol. And what this is it's a treatment based on putting the patient who has rabies into a coma. And once they put the person into a coma, they're actually able to suppress the body functions, hopefully enough to fight off the virus using their own chemicals. And through this method, they've actually been able to bring up the survival rate of rabies from 0% to 8%. So it's a small step, but a quite big step considering rabies used to be 100% fatal. Anyhow, rabies' ability to completely take over your brain like this, I would call it quite cool. I should mention that rabies is, as I mentioned before, it's a negative sense single-stranded RNA virus. And I'm actually going to go over a whole bunch of these because this is my favorite group of viruses. The next one I'd like to talk about is Lassa fever virus. I don't know how many of you have heard of Lassa virus, but although it's quite rare, it's found in Africa. This is what the virus looks like in attacking tissue. It's little round things there. It also has that single-stranded RNA genome I mentioned. However, the unique thing about Lassa virus is its genome is called ambisense genome. And so typically when you think of DNA or RNA, your cell can only read it one way. So if you have a sentence that goes, the cat ate the dog, something like that, your body can only read it as the cat ate the dog and make sense of it. With this virus, it actually is a sentence. Its genome can actually be read both ways. So it actually uses its genome in different ways to actually produce proteins from both sides from both ways of reading this one single strand. It's one of, I think, 3 viruses known to do this, so it's quite unique. It's typically transmitted through vectors, which are insects, most commonly, or not only insects, but animals. It's most commonly transmitted through mosquitoes and rodents. Only 20% of cases of Lassa fever exhibit symptoms, but the ones that do exhibit symptoms are usually fatal because Lassa fever has the unique ability of targeting most of the tissues in your body. So whereas most of the viruses I mentioned before are very specific towards a specific type of tissue, like Poliovirus attacks your gut tissue and your nervous system tissue, and even that is quite broad. Rabies virus only ever attacks your nervous tissue. Most viruses attack one type of tissue. Lassa fever attacks everything. And because of this, you get a wide variety of symptoms. You get fever, bloody vomiting, bloody diarrhea. It's called viral hemorrhagic fever because it causes the hemorrhaging I mentioned before. It actually causes, because it attacks your nervous system as well, it can cause tachycardia, which is an increased blood heart rate, so your heart will be beating really, really fast. It can actually change your blood pressure dramatically, not only high but also low, so you can be switching between different blood pressures quite rapidly. It can cause encephalitis, which is where your brain swells inside of your head, and meningitis, which is inflammation of the tissue surrounding both your brain and your spinal column. And it can also cause deafness and seizures as it attacks your brain. So this one virus is quite capable of doing quite a bit of damage to your body. Also quite cool. So back to this one, Ebolavirus, the Mickey Mouse virus I mentioned before. This is also another single-stranded RNA virus. It has that lipid envelope around it at the skin. It's transmitted through body fluids as well as possibly aerosols, but they haven't confirmed it yet. It is characterized by the Mickey Mouse tail, as I mentioned before, and there are 5 known types of Ebolavirus. The picture I'm showing here is a typical case of some of the more deadly types of Ebolavirus, though it's important to point out that out of the 5 types of Ebolavirus they have now, one of them doesn't infect humans at all. It was actually discovered in the States back in the 1980s, and nobody was infected at all during this. The two most recent types have much lesser fatality in humans, whereas Ebola Zaire has up to 90% fatality. And this virus, Ebola Zaire, at least that type of serotype of it, causes the same hemorrhagic symptoms I mentioned before. So pretty much you'll be bleeding out of every mucous membrane of your body. It includes your nose, your eyes, your throat. So it's quite deadly virus to get, but also way cool. And before I start moving into the next topic, I'd just like to talk about one more neat type of virus. So, as I mentioned before, that really big virus called megavirus, that's part of a family of viruses that are really, really big. There's another one called Parvovirus. It infects an organism called Papillomavirus. I'm not pronouncing it properly, but apologies. Anyhow, it has another really big genome, which makes it blur the lines between virus and cell. But the unique thing about CRO-V is CRO-V is a virus that has a virus that attacks it. So it's a virus that has a virus of its own. And as you can see here, this is actually inside of the cell. This is what's called the virus factory. So this is where CRO-V is replicating inside of the cell. And if you look at where those little white arrows are, those are little viruses called MA-virus. And MA-virus is a really, really small virus. And what happens with MA-virus is if you put it in a container with the host organism I mentioned before, it lacks the ability to actually attack the host organism, so it does nothing. If that host organism happens to be also infected with CRO-V, this other virus, which is going to be killing the host, at that point the smaller virus, MA-virus, can attack the host and kill off the big virus. So it can actually save a population of this host from the big virus by killing it off. And the complexity of this virus seems to be what's allowing the smaller satellite virus to do this. There's actually 2 known virophage or satellite viruses, as they're called. So the fact that virus looks in that virus is also pretty cool. So as my final little short part of my presentation, I'd like to take it back to the big picture, as I mentioned before. So just taking a quick look at the environment, this is the ocean. I don't know how many of you know, but in 1 milliliter of seawater, so that's 1 cubic centimeter, there is approximately 10 million viruses. If you look at the whole ocean, there is 10 to the 30 viruses, which doesn't mean a lot to most people. So to put this in perspective, if you assume all of these viruses are about average size, and you line all these viruses up end on end on end, these viruses would stretch 10 million light years across. No. Is it 10 million? Yes, it is 10 million. 10 million light years across. So that's quite far. To put in perspective, we live in the Milky Way, which is 1 galaxy, and this includes all of the planets that we typically think of. If you span these viruses all across virus to virus to virus, these actually span to the nearest 60 galaxies. So there's a lot of viruses in the ocean. A different way of thinking about it is the amount of carbon stored in all the viruses in the ocean is about 200 megatons. To put this, so that's 200 million tons of carbon. To put this into perspective, before whaling started, all the whales in the ocean in total contained only 13 million tons of carbon. So there's an incredible amount of carbon in the viruses in the ocean. So what are these viruses doing? These viruses are typically infecting bacteria, so you don't have to worry about getting infected when you swim. However, half of the Earth's oxygen is produced on a daily basis by bacteria in the ocean. And these viruses actually kill off 20% of those bacteria every day. So they can have quite a big impact on the amount of oxygen produced, as well as other nutrient cycles in the ocean, such as phosphorus and nitrogen. Before I just step away from the environment, I'd just like to point out that these are also common in the soil. In about a gram of soil, you'll see anywhere from 1 to 10 billion viruses in 1 gram of soil, depending on which environment you're in. And as a part of a study I'm doing right now with my lab, we've actually found that viruses can be transmitted on air particles in the air quite diversely. So they're all over the place, which makes them quite cool. And finally, I'd just like to take a step back and look at life as a whole. So this is largely becoming philosophical because it's difficult to go back to the beginning. But if you look back to that picture I showed at the beginning of the cell, and you remember that little command center I showed you called the nucleus, did anybody see any connections between that and the virus? So some people hypothesize that the first cell actually originated from a virus, and that the nucleus actually became the capsid of the virus, or rather the capsid of the virus became the nucleus, because as you can see, they both have that protective coat protecting the nucleic acid. So it's possible that the nucleus is actually a viral origin. Different genes that we use are like necessary for our lives, are actually from viruses. They've demonstrated that one of the proteins necessary in allowing the placenta to attach to the fetus during childbirth came from a virus. So unless this virus had brought us that gene from a different organism, we would have lacked the ability to have babies as we do now. And additionally, some people know that most of your DNA is actually non-coding to proteins that we use. And most of that DNA, it does have function. Most of it we haven't discovered yet because we seem to concentrate on things that we can see functionally. But most of that DNA, about 80% of our genome actually has viral origin. So it's just like junk DNA has been dumped in our genome from viruses. So viruses could have had a major impact on our evolution as organisms, as well as many other organisms in the past. And I personally think this makes viruses way cool. But that brings me to the end of my presentation. So if any of you are interested, I can walk you through an activity to show you just how small viruses are. And I'm going to be doing this quite simply by tearing paper. So if anybody wants to participate, we'll just hand you out a piece of paper.
You're welcome. Did anybody else need a?
Okay, so what you have in front of you is a standard piece of paper. It's 8.5 by 11. So if you take the long side, this is 11 inches across. This represents about 30 centimeters. It's 27.94 centimeters. So if you fold it across that into a hamburger fold, you might want to fold it again for when you're tearing it. But, and then you tear it in half. It doesn't matter if you tear nicely, because pretty much you're only going to be using that one side throughout the rest of the thing. You can throw out the rest of your paper. So, this new length you have with you now is about the size of an iPhone. It is 13.97 centimeters. Okay, everybody good so far? So if we fold it again the same way, so across that same length again, and you rip it there again, and you'll get a length of about this big. Okay. So, the length across this piece of paper now is 7 centimeters. This is about the length of a young Madagascar hissing cockroach. So, you tear it in half again. So fold it again in half across that same line. This is tear 3, by the way. This is 3.5 centimeters. This is about the size of a paper clip. So, fold it in half again for fold number 4. Fold number 4 is about this big. This is 1.7 centimeters. This is about the size of your thumb, or one of your bigger fingers. So, if you fold it in half again for fold number 5, you'll have a piece of paper that is about 1 centimeter in length. And I didn't have one for this because most of you know what about 1 centimeter is. So, if you fold it in half again, tear number 6. At which point I have started to lose my ability to tear paper. that same length of paper there is about 0.4 centimeters. And it should be about the width of a pencil. So if you fold that piece of paper again,
I can hear that.
should be getting difficult now.
It's not difficult for me.
And you'll get 0.2 centimeters. At which point I'm assuming most of you will have reached the limit of paper tearing.
And I can't hear that.
So, is anybody still going with paper tearing? So if you tear that in half again, across the same line, for tear number 8,
Oh.
you now have 1 millimeter. About 1 millimeter, which is the smallest space between two lines you have on a ruler.
Oh. That's nice.
And I'm impressed if any of you can go farther than this. But if you tear it one more time, that is the distance, the approximate distance between two dots that your eyes can actually differentiate without a microscope.
Oh.
If you tear it 2 more times, 2 more times, so that gets up to tear 11. Tear 11 is the width of a hair.
Oh, that's nice.
If you tear it 2 more times after that, so 13 tears in total, that is the width of a skin cell.
Ooh.
And like already the past few tears you can no longer see with your eyes.
Oh. All right.
If you tear it 2 more times, so up to 15 tears, that is the width of a red blood cell.
Which is even smaller than
So,
this.
the interesting thing about the red blood cell width is it's also the width of your X chromosome. And the reason why this doesn't fit inside your red blood cells is because your red blood cells actually don't have any new DNA in them.
That's cool.
If you tear it 2 more times, again, up to tear 17, this is the width of a bacteria.
A small one or a big one?
Medium-sized one, E. coli. So, if you tear it 2 more times after that, so 19 tears in total, you then get the biggest virus that I showed on the screen today, megavirus. And if you tear it 5 more times after that in total, so for a total of 24 times, that is the width of a parvovirus,
Ooh,
which is the smallest virus we have shown today.
That's pretty.
And considering the fact that most of us were only able to get up to, what was it, tear 7, tear 8, to get up to 24 tears is quite small. But that's how small the realm of viruses is. So I hope that puts it into a bit of perspective as to actually how small cells are and viruses are. So thanks for coming out today, everybody. If you have any more questions, feel free to come down and talk to me.